Welcome to Who Shaves the Barber, a weekly podcast where we explore paradoxes, thought experiments, and other pointless problems. I'm William Nava. Okay, so I've got with me Professor Graham Priest. Graham is a professor of philosophy at the CUNY Grad Center in New York. I have had the pleasure of taking a class with him on the problem of vagueness and the Sorites Paradox. Graham specializes in metaphysics and logic, and particularly in the realm of metaphysics, he's known for his doing investigations about Buddhist metaphysics, and in logic, he's particularly known for his contributions to Paraconsistent logic, which are forms of logic that allow for contradictions. And also he's known for just popularizing and defending the view known as dialetheism, which is the metaphysical view that there are such things as contradictions that are true. Would you say that that's a fair introduction, Graham?
Yep.
Fantastic. So Graham, I started to get acquainted with your work more closely when I encountered a book of yours called One, which was, I think, is still your most recent publication.
Yep.
Right. So in that book, you talk a bit about Bradley's regress and the unity of the proposition. Is one of the first things that you talk about. So I want to dive right into that because I consider those issues to be very interesting ones, and I think you have interesting thoughts on them. So can you just tell us what is the problem of the unity of the proposition?
Okay. Well, first of all, this is a special case of a much more general problem about what constitutes the unity of anything in general. But I think to the extent that 20th century philosophers have thought about it, which is perhaps not much, the special case they thought about is the unity of the proposition. So you find discussions of this in Frege, in Bradley, in Russell, three of the great early 20th century, late 19th century philosophers. And it's something like this. Let's take a very simple proposition. Socrates is sitting. Okay. Not very original, I'm afraid, but it'll do, right? Okay. Now, the name Socrates refers to a bloke, the stub-nosed ancient Greek philosopher that, we all love, except the Athenians who didn't love him because they put him to death. That's another matter. Okay. So, Socrates refers to that bloke. Is sitting, well, that's kind of funny. Does it refer to anything? Well, sure, it's got a meaning. What is it? Well, the meaning is, most obvious thing is it's the property of sitting. Okay, so you've got the subject of the sentence referring to a bloke. You've got the predicate is sitting, which refers to a property. All right. Now, Socrates is sitting is a single thing. All right. It's a unitary proposition. Now, the question of the unity of the proposition is, how do those two bits, the bloke and the property, combine to form one thing? Because if I just give you a list, hey, Socrates, property sitting, that's not a proposition, right? That's just a list of two things. Somehow or other, these two things have to cooperate to form a unity. That's the problem of the unity of the proposition. How the hell do they do this?
So the first thing that would come to mind to me is to say that there's this relationship of application. Right?
Sure.
So there's there's a relationship between Socrates and his sitting, and it's one that is sitting
Sure.
applies to Socrates. So is there any way that
good?
Yeah.
So look, let's reparse this. This is going to take us to Bradley Regress, okay? But let me go to it through what you just said. Our example was Socrates is sitting. Okay, let's reparse that. Socrates is sitting. Okay, now Socrates still refers to the bloke. Now we take sitting to refer to the property, And you got this word is. Now, what you've just suggested is that this refers to, well, philosophers call it instantiation, or the relation of having the property, being a property bearer. But it's a relation between the subject, Socrates, and the property sitting. Okay, that's the suggestion. The trouble is, that doesn't seem to get you anywhere, because now you've got three things. You've got Socrates, instantiation, and sittingness. Actually, what was it? Was the original sitting, or was it read? No, it's sitting, wasn't it?
Sitting.
Yeah. Okay. Sitting. So now you've got Socrates and instantiation, the relation, and sittingness. Okay. That's still three things. So the question then becomes, how do those go together to form unity? Now, what we see here is actually an illustration of the Bradley regress. Okay. Namely, suppose you want to explain how two things form a unity. And you say, well, hey, there's some third thing bang in the middle, which does the job of making unity. Oh, that's fine. Okay. In your case, it was a relation of instantiation. But now you've just got three things, and there's a question of how the new thing you've interposed relates to the first two things. And if you say, well, okay, obviously there's got to be something which relates those two things, you got the same problem again. So you're often a regress, and that's the Bradley regress.
Right. So essentially, we had Socrates and sitting, and those got sort of put together by the word is. But now we need to ask, okay, how is right the instantiation and Socrates and sitting? What's putting those together? And so you're going to need some kind of higher level instantiation, let's say, but that can go on indefinitely.
Yeah. Just to be precise, it's not the word is that's doing the joining. That's at the level of syntax. What we're talking about is the level of meaning, right? But it's what is refers to, namely the instantiation relation. So you've got, three things now, and you want to know what joins the instantiation relation to Socrates on one side and sitting on the other. And you're in the same situation. And apparently this is a vicious regress. So
would you say that the problem of the unity of the proposition is a kind of special case, or like a special case of Bradley's regress? Yeah.
Well, it's an application of Bradley's regress. In his philosophy, Bradley deploys the regress for various ends of his own, which are much more general than the ones we've been talking about. So in that sense, it's an application of the Bradley regress. Bradley had bigger fish to fry.
Okay. It's reminiscent of the third man argument.
Yes.
Would you say that it's of a kind? Like, what would you say? It's sort of like a different version of the same argument, or is there a significant difference?
Look, it's not exactly the same, but it's closely related. So the third man argument arises for the following reason. You're dealing with the problem of universals. Now let's take red. So there's this thing, redness, and then there's a bunch of red things in the world. How is it that these red things can relate to this abstract universal? The standard word is, well, they instantiate it, so instantiations come back. Now, Plato has a worry about instantiation, but it's not quite the same as the Bradley regress. It's this. Plato has a quite strange view to the effect that a universal instantiates its form. Okay, so in other words, just to put it in very simple terms, redness is itself red, and happiness is itself happy. It's a kind of strange view, but it's because he's thinking of these properties, these forms as kind of paradigms. Okay. Now, if you throw that into the mixture, you get a real problem, because now you've got all these red things, and you've got the property redness itself, which is also red. So it would seem to be that there's a kind of a higher form of redness, which applies to all these guys, the sort of red things we started with, redness itself, and that's got to be red, and then you're off in a regress.
I see.
Okay. And Plato thinks it's a vicious regress. But it's a bit more than a Bradley regress, just because you're adding in this kind of strange view that a universal actually has the property that it is. So, redness is itself red.
Right. Okay. But it does seem to have the same kind of general structure.
Well, in both cases, there's a regress. And in both cases, many people have taken this regress to be vicious. So, regresses are everywhere in philosophy. They're not necessarily vicious. Look, there's nothing problem about now being preceded by a minute ago, which was preceded by a minute before that, which was preceded by a minute before that, forever. Okay? At one time, people thought the cosmos was like that. Newton thought the cosmos was like that. Well, we think it isn't now, but there's nothing logically impossible about time going backwards forever. Okay, so that's a regress. It's not vicious. Whereas I think the Bradley regress is vicious, and Plato certainly thought that the third man regress was vicious.
So, what makes a regress vicious or not vicious?
Good. Well, this is something philosophers argue about, right? And I'm not sure there's a consensus on the matter. However, what I think the answer is this. Let me give you my favourite example of a regress that's vicious. So you got a chain, right? You want to make a necklace. At the moment, it's just a chain. There's a link at either end, and to make it a necklace, you've got to join those two links. Question: how do you join the links? Answer: you put in an intervening link. All right, okay, well, yeah, but then how do you join the intervening link to the two ends? Well, you put in an intervening link. This is obviously vicious. Doesn't get you anywhere, right? Now, what's gone wrong here? What's gone wrong is not the fact that you've got an infinitude. That's really not what the issue is. What's gone wrong is this. You're starting with a problem, how to join the links. You get a solution, and you've got exactly the same problem. That's why the regress is generated. But what has gone wrong is you haven't really solved the problem, because you've given an answer which has exactly the same problem. That's what makes this kind of regress vicious, if it's generated by that kind of scenario. And in the case of the Bradley regress, saying, as you suggested, well, hey, just join the Socrates and the property of sitting with instantiation. You've got the original problem. You wanted to know how to join the first two guys together. Now you want to know how to join the middle guy to the first two guys. Same thing.
So what makes the regress vicious is it's really sort of relative to a problem that you're trying to solve.
Sure.
Here's a regress that I'm particularly interested in, and it would seem to me that based on what you just said that this is a vicious regress. The regress of justification. So in order to say that you know X, you must have some justification that allows you to believe that Y, but then you need a justification for that. Yep. And so that would seem to lead you down a regress. Would you say that that is, at least in principle, also a vicious regress?
Look, this is a very good question. So we're dealing with epistemology here, okay? The reasons you have for accepting things. Now, the argument you're giving is quite a famous one. It's an argument that Sextus Empiricus uses. Sextus is a skeptic, and he says, well, how do you know this? Well, one possible answer is, I give you a reason. How do you know that? Well, you give a reason, blah, 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 blah. And that regress is vicious because you never bottom out. So there are some philosophers, some epistemologists, who agree that that is a vicious regress. These guys are called foundationists. So these are people who think that you must have ultimate justifications for things. So this regress cannot go on forever. However, there's a different kind of theory in epistemology called Well, most usual name is coherentism. And in coherentism, you don't have to suppose there's a foundation. So you can have a regress as long as all the things you say hang together in a certain sense. It doesn't matter if it doesn't bottom out. So whether or not that the sextus regress is vicious is part of an ongoing debate between the epistemological foundationalists and the epistemological coherentists.
I don't want to go too deeply into the epistemology, but would you say that you're a coherentist?
Yes. I mean, there are many kinds of coherentism, okay? But I'm not a foundationalist for sure.
Okay. I ask because the sort of that the structure that coherentism has, this sort of idea that if all of the pieces of knowledge sort of hang together in a sort of network of relations that doesn't necessarily have to be grounded on something, that sort of reminds me a little bit of the metaphysical picture that you give in one. It has a similar kind of structure. It's about metaphysics, not about epistemology, but there's seems to be something similar going on.
So what you're referring to is the stuff towards the end of the book where I talk about the metaphysics of emptiness, the Buddhist notion of emptiness, and the metaphor of the net of Indra. And that's exactly an anti-foundationalist metaphysical picture. Mm-hmm. So at the moment, as you may know, and some of your listeners may know, there's a sort of a fairly hot topic in metaphysics, which goes by the name of grounding. The traditional name would be ontological dependence. So some things depend for being what they are on other things. I depend for being what I am on my parts. A shadow of a tree depends for being what it is on the tree, and so on. Now, you have this kind of structure of ontological dependence. So, A depends on B depends on C depends on blah, blah, blah. Does that ground out? And many people who work in this area think that just like the epistemological foundationalists, the answer has to be yes. There must be a kind of ultimate ground to reality. So these are the metaphysical analogues of the epistemological foundationalists. And the metaphysical story that I tell in the sort of last sections of last chapter 1 is anti-foundationalist. And it has kind of the same structure as coherentism, epistemological coherentism.
There's also something about this the structure of this sort of this regress that reminds me a little bit of the problems with self-reference, the paradoxes of self-reference, only because there's this same issue of what we have here is that there's essentially let's keep going with the justification one. You have some let's say piece of knowledge, and that undergoes a kind of process, or maybe you could look at it as a function that asks for a justification. And so the output of that process then gets subjected to the same requirement, and that's what creates the regress. Do you think that there is a connection there to the kind of to the structure of the paradoxes of self-reference, because they have that same kind of?
Yes, there's a connection. So everybody's favorite example of the paradox of self-reference is the liar paradox. Okay, so let's put it in this form. This proposition is false. Hey, what proposition? Well, the proposition, this proposition is false. But what's that proposition? Okay, you got the regress. Okay, because every time you want to say, well, what is the proposition, this proposition is false, you get referred back to the proposition, this proposition is false. So there's certainly a regress here. Now, the question is what to make of that. Some people have inferred that this makes the proposition meaningless. That's not at all obvious, because prima facie you've understood it. Some people have argued that the proposition is quite meaningful, but it's neither true nor false. And some people have said, well, as far as the regress goes, this is not vicious at all. Now, these are hard issues in discussion of the paradoxes, and there's a lot to be said about each of these possible options, which is probably not useful to go into here. But certainly, you're dead right that the regress is there. What to make of it is something that logicians still argue about.
Okay. I agree that it probably wouldn't make sense to get too deeply into the nitty-gritty of it, but I'm wondering if you could say a word, just a quick word, about why you don't agree with the idea that because you've got this vicious regress in trying to identify what the subject of the proposition is, that doesn't make it meaningless. Because I find that to be the most common reaction that I hear when I talk to people about the liar.
Yeah. Well, look, there are several ways you can look at this. First of all, when I formulated the paradox, I did this in terms of propositions. So propositions are meanings, essentially, okay? But there's another way you can formulate the paradox, not to refer to meanings, but just to refer to sentences. This sentence is false. Okay, right. Now, already we hit the question of what kind of thing it is to which you attribute truth. Sentences, propositions, okay, that's an issue. But let's suppose that it's legitimate to attribute truth to sentences of an interpreted language. Then consider now the lie sentence in the form, this sentence is false. What sentence is that? You haven't got a regress in the first place, just because you can actually point to the damn thing. So the existence of the sentence is not in question.
Because the sentence is really just a collection of words, right?
Because you can see it written on the piece of paper, okay?
Right.
So the regress never gets off the ground, as it were. So if that's a legitimate way of formulating the problem, you can't invoke the regress. Now, okay, the fact there's no regress doesn't necessarily mean that the thing's meaningful. It might be meaningless for all kinds of reasons. Now we have to worry about what constitutes meaningfulness. So we're into really hard territory here. But prima facie, this sentence is false, is meaningful. The self-reference doesn't deprive something of meaning. This sentence has 5 words. Perfectly meaningful? Obviously true. So the fact that self-reference is involved does not deprive the thing of meaning. So if there is something which deprives this prima facie meaningful thing of meaning, what the hell is it? Okay, and if you want to say the thing's meaningless, you better have a pretty good answer to that. And all sorts of things are going to stand in the way of this.
So let me cut you off for a moment, just because there's a specific direction I would like to go with this. Is if we go with the proposition version, so we are talking about meanings.
Okay.
The objection I'm interested in is the objection that says the reason we should call this meaningless is because we can't pin down a subject. And in order for a proposition to be meaningful, it's got to be about something. But when we try to identify what it is that it's about, we're off on the vicious regress. We can't identify the thing that it is actually about. It's not about anything in particular, therefore it's meaningless. What's your sort of objection to that particular line of attack?
How about this proposition is expressed in a sentence with 5 words? Which proposition? Okay, you know the answer. I mean, the fact that you've got a regress doesn't make something meaningless. Otherwise, that sentence would be meaningless because it involves a regress. But, it's true, right? It's not meaningless.
Yeah. That makes sense to me. I mean, we understand it when we say it, and we only start to question the potential problem of it being a regress when we have an issue like the liar, where it leads us to a contradiction. But in other cases, we don't really.
Sure. And the more you think about these things, the worse it gets, because we know from various results in formal logic that there's no way, if I give you a sentence in a language that involves self-reference, There's no algorithm, no decision procedure for deciding whether it gives rise to this paradox. Okay? Now, if the fact that it gave rise to a paradox was sufficient to guarantee meaninglessness, that would mean that in general you don't know whether the things you say are meaningful or not. In particular cases you will, but there's no algorithm for this. So it looks as though, sometimes you don't know whether you're talking gibberish or not. Well, okay, that's kind of attractive in a certain sense, but not in the sense I mean, I think.
Okay. So let me because now we've sort of talked about a couple of different versions of problems that have this kind of a regress. Let me bring it back to the Bradley's regress, because you do think it's a vicious regress, but presumably you do think that things have properties, and that you can say things. So what? In a nutshell, what is your way of dealing with it?
Okay, in a nutshell, it's this. Let's take it in the instantiation form. Okay? Socrates instantiates sitting. I think that the instantiates refers to something, that thing, let's call it instantiation, okay, is identical to Socrates and identical to sitting. Literally, numerically identical. Okay, that breaks the Bradley regress, because if instantiation is literally identical to Socrates, then there's nothing that needs to be done to join them. There's no sort of space between them, metaphorically, metaphysically, which needs filling. That's the solution. Now, you don't have to think about it so very long to see that it has a pretty obvious implication. I don't want to say that Socrates and sitting are the same thing. That's a bit silly. Okay? What I'm telling you, though, what I think, is that instantiation is identical to Socrates and instantiation is identical to sittingness. So it follows that identity cannot be, as logicians say, transitive. Okay? So transitivity is a property of a relation. In the case of identity, it goes, if A is B and B is C, then A is C. That's called the transitivity identity. And the transitivity identity is pretty orthodox in the history of logic, certainly in the last 200 years. So if you go the route that I've just suggested, you've got to deny that. And that means you're going to have to do a lot of hard work to, show that this is really coherent.
Okay. So the instantiation relation is identical to Socrates and identical to sitting, but Socrates and sitting are not identical to each other.
Correct.
So we need to reject that law that says, well, if Socrates is identical to instantiation, then and instantiation is identical to sitting, then Socrates must be identical to sitting. We must not
Correct.
be able to make that inference.
Correct.
Yeah, I mean, intuitively, the I don't know, first sort of instinct is to go, no way, that doesn't make any sense. So I understand that there's sort of formalism that goes along with making sense of it, but without getting into the formalism of it, is there a kind of quick surface level version of the story that you can give to make some sense of it?
Look, it's hard to do this quickly. However, paraconsistent logic gets into the story. So you need to know a little bit about that. In paraconsistent logic, you can have a contradiction. It doesn't imply everything. So in standard logic, once you've got a contradiction, it implies everything. Formal paraconsistent logics now are kind of, where are we? Oh gosh, 60, 70 years old. So we know how to construct logics in which contradictions don't imply everything. Now, one feature of such logics is that a principle of inference called the disjunctive syllogism breaks down. Okay. So let me put this simply but misleadingly, but it'll relate it to the problem of the transitivity of identity. One way of thinking about this principle of inference is this. You can't infer from A and A if and only if B to B. No, let me rephrase that again to make it even clearer. In a paraconsistent logic for the appropriate conditional, you can't go from A if and only if B, B if and only if C, to A if and only if C. So that relation is not transitive.
In paraconsistent logic?
Yes.
Is that because you don't have the disjunctive syllogism?
Yes.
Can you say, just for people who don't know what that is, quickly, what the disjunctive syllogism is?
Well, the standard version of the disjunctive syllogism is this inference. Suppose A and not A or B, then B. Because if you've got not A or B, well, the A rules that out, you're just left with B. That's the rationale that's offered. Okay. All right? So, when you go through the machinations, that's going to tell you that for the material conditional, not A or B, okay, that is not going to be transitive. So for that conditional, you can have A if and only if B, B if and only if C, but not A if and only if C. All right. Now, there's a standard definition of identity in terms of the biconditional. Namely, two objects are identical just if one has a property if and only if the other does. Mm-hmm. So that's a Leibnizian definition of identity. Now, because that biconditional, the if and only if, is not transitive, identity is not going to be transitive either. Okay, so that's how it happens. Now, of course, the next thing you want to ask is, well, why is paraconsistency getting in on the act? Because nothing that we've talked about so far is to suggest that there's an inconsistency here. That part of the story has to come from somewhere else.
So I kind of want to help sort of reason through why this makes sense, given that we're working with a paraconsistent logic. So the disjunctive syllogism you said was, if you have not A or B, right? So one of the premises is...
Not A or B.
That's one premise? Not A or B?
No.
Not...
One premise is a disjunction.
Which is not A or B.
No, you don't negate the disjunction.
Oh, I see.
You got a disjunction with two disjuncts. One of them is B, and one of them is not A.
Gotcha.
That's one premise. Then the second premise is just A.
Gotcha.
So you've got this disjunction, B, right, and not A. Along comes A and says, hey, it can't be look, this disjunction's true. One of the disjuncts has got to be true. Hey, it's not A because A rules that out. They're left with B.
Right.
The disjunctive system and the rationale for it.
Right. And yeah, so what I wanted to sort of spell out for people is that it makes sense that we shouldn't accept that if we're working with a paraconsistent logic, because the A doesn't rule out the not A.
Sure. I mean, if you think that some contradictions might hold, then clearly the A does not rule out the not A, because both might be the case.
Right.
So that's a major reason why, in a paraconsistent logic, the disjunctive syllogism doesn't work.
Okay, yeah. So that makes sense. And so from that follows what you said about the biconditional, the if and only if, and then from that the fact that it's that a law of identity defined through a biconditional is not going to be transitive.
Correct.
So, okay, so bringing it out of logic, like you said, there now is this question of like, well, how did paraconsistency get in here, right? Why did we have to sort of go to contradiction in discussing this problem that didn't seem to really involve that so far?
Okay. Let me answer that by talking about one of the standard solutions to the unity of the proposition. This is the one that was suggested by Frege. Okay? So, Frege come back to our example. Socrates is sitting. Frege says that the name Socrates refers to the bloke. Okay. An object. Is sitting refers to, well, it's a property, but he's got a special name for this thing, a concept. Okay, so you've got Socrates refers to an object, is sitting refers to a concept. Okay, so how do these work together to produce a unity? Well, what he says is this. Concepts are kind of special. They have a gap in them. All right? So you've got the object, which is sort of complete, and you've got a concept which has a gap in it. And what comes along, what forms the unity, is the object comes along and fills the gap. Okay, that's what creates the unity. Now, fine, that sounds good. I mean, having a gap in is a metaphor, but that's not particularly a problem. The problem is this. Let's think about the concept is sitting. I've just referred to that with a noun phrase, the concept sitting. And if you refer to something by a noun phrase, it's an object. So, the capital of the United States, the weather in Melbourne, the president of India. Okay, you refer to these things with definite descriptions, and you're referring to an object. Okay. Now remember, Frege's claim is that the concept sitting has a gap in it. But the concept sitting refers to an object, and an object doesn't have a gap in it, because it's an object. Frege is well aware of this problem. I mean, his example is the concept horse, right? And he doesn't know what to do with it. But what it illustrates is this. First of all, if you've got something which accounts for the kind of the unity, it can't just be an object. It's got to be something over and above a simple object. Otherwise, you've just got a list of objects. For Frege, this is because the concept has a gap in it. However, we talk about these things. We talk about whatever it is that's doing the joining. And in doing so, we cannot but treat it as an object. Okay, just as Frege has to. So it looks as though, Frege is just an illustration. The general point is this. This joiny thing, one calls it a gluon, can't be an object because it's got to be something kind of special to do the joining. But it is an object because we talk about it and refer to it as one. So we seem to be dealing with objects, things which are both objects and not objects. That's where the paraconsistency or the dialetheism comes in.
So the fact that you're sort of, the problem kind of puts you up against the wall in having to posit something that has to be an object because we need to be able to talk about it, right? But at the same time needs to have a property which is a property that objects can't have, which is having this, again, metaphorically, this Fregean gap.
Yeah, essentially.
And so, put up against the wall with the situation, the way that you respond is to essentially posit a contradictory, or an object that has a contradictory property of being both an object and not an object.
Sure. And the fact that it's contradictory doesn't explain how it makes the join. Okay? But the fact that it's contradictory explains why you need a paraconsistent logic. The paraconsistent logic delivers you a theory of identity, which allows you to say that the joiny thing is identical to both things it joins. So that's the kind of big picture stuff.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it, I mean, it certainly doesn't explain everything, but at least it does. It goes some way to explaining how this object can sort of, again, be both a thing and then also have this sort of special property needed to resolve the problem, which it seems like a thing wouldn't be able to have.
Sure. I mean, there's obviously lots to argue about there. I mean, I don't claim that any of the things I said is obvious, on the contrary. But, you know, in the first part of the book one, these things are discussed and defended in detail.
Right.
You know, this is not the place to go into that.
Yeah. Well,
Buy the book.
Yeah, the book is fantastic. So, and I think at this point we'll pretty much wrap up with this subject. There's one other thing I want to talk to you about in depth, but the book is, you know, I will put in the plug. The book is really fascinating. This is the first part. The second part is a fairly in-depth analysis of Plato's Parmenides, and then the third part is a kind of exposition of Buddhist metaphysics, your sort of presentation of it, and you kind of in a way sort of reminiscent of what we've been talking about. You don't fully bring all of it together, but I think there's this sort of implied sense in which the structure of the book suggests a unity of the three subject matters.
Well, when I wrote the book, I was worried that the three bits didn't hang together, which is kind of an irony in a book called One, right? But so I tried my best to draw the threads together, and the threads do come together in a number of ways. One way they come together is in the topic of nothingness. Now, we haven't talked about that. Let's not go there. Okay. Since then, I've thought of other ways in which I could have drawn the threads of the book together better. So we'll see if the book ever does a second edition.
Well, for what it's worth, there's a sense in which I took the fact that the drawing together isn't very explicit as a kind of challenge to the reader to sort of note where it's sort of implied or to sort of fill it in. So I kind of, from a kind of, let's say, artistic perspective, I appreciated actually that there was a kind of implication that there's a unity, but it wasn't fully explicit. And that concludes today's episode of Who Shapes the Barber? Next week, I continue my conversation with Professor Graham Priest as we shift our focus to the problem of vagueness and the paradox it gives rise to, the Sorites Paradox, also known as the paradox of the heap. Again, I'm William Nava. You can check out other episodes, as well as my other philosophical and artistic work at williamnava.com. And if you'd like to subscribe to this podcast, go to williamnava.podbean.com. Thank you so much for listening.